On May 24, 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered the withdrawal of the German U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic. Germany had lost 43 submarines in that month, 25% of its entire operational strength in 31 days. Germany had begun May of 1943 with 240 operational U-boats, the largest submarine force in German naval history, and had used them at full operational intensity against the Allied convoys. It ended the month with 197 submarines, a convoy campaign that had failed to sink a single ship in the last major battle of the month, and a war diary entry from Dönitz that described the situation plainly. The losses were operationally unsustainable. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Germany had nearly won in March of 1943 when its submarines sank nearly 700,000 tons in a single month, was effectively over in May. 43 submarines destroyed, 31 days, 25% of Germany's entire operational submarine strength, 240 U-boats at the start of May of 1943. The largest submarine fleet Germany had ever assembled. Dönitz himself called it the Stalingrad of the U-boat arm. If this story matters to you, subscribe to the channel. Just subscribe, that is all. Thank you. The mathematical foundation of the German U-boat campaign strategy was Tonnagekrieg, the tonnage war. Grand Admiral Dönitz had calculated that if his submarines could sink Allied merchant tonnage faster than Allied shipyards could produce replacement ships, the cumulative deficit would eventually become unsustainable for Britain. Every merchant ship sunk reduced the volume of food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials arriving in Britain from North America. If that volume fell below the minimum required to sustain British military operations and civilian subsistence, Britain's strategic position would become untenable. The strategy did not require the U-boats to defeat the Royal Navy in surface combat. It required them to sink cargo ships at a sustained rate that consistently exceeded Allied construction and replacement capacity. By March of 1943, the strategy was demonstrably and measurably working. German U-boats sank 693,000 tons of Allied merchant shipping in that single month. Allied shipyard capacity, including the massive American wartime production surge then underway, was producing approximately 700,000 tons of replacement shipping per month. The margin between what Germany was destroying each month and what the Allies were building was fewer than 10,000 tons. The British Admiralty produced a classified internal assessment in March of 1943 that concluded the U-boat campaign might succeed in severing Britain's supply lines before the American industrial expansion could fully close the gap. The assessment was not alarmist speculation produced by frightened or pessimistic staff officers. It was the honest professional analysis of an organization looking at the available operational numbers and finding the trajectory alarming. Germany had also developed the logistical infrastructure required to sustain the U-boat campaign at operational scale. Type 14th U-boats, designated Milchke, meaning milk cow, were purpose-built submarine tankers designed to resupply operational U-boats at sea, extending their patrol ranges without requiring them to return to a French port. By combining the standard Wolfpack attack doctrine with the milk cow resupply system, Dönitz could maintain substantially more U-boats in the operational Atlantic patrol zones simultaneously than the distances from their French Atlantic coast ports would otherwise allow. The Wolfpack tactic coordinated multiple U-boats against individual convoys simultaneously, overwhelming the defensive capacity of escort vessels through attacks from multiple directions. The fundamental vulnerability in the German operational model was therefore geography. The Allied convoy routes from North America to Britain crossed the central North Atlantic, and the mid-ocean portion of that crossing was beyond the operational reach of land-based aircraft from either shore. This zone, roughly between 600 and 800 miles from either coast, depending on weather and aircraft operational range, was called the air gap, or informally, the Black Pit. Aircraft were among the most effective anti-submarine platforms available in 1943. An aircraft approaching a surfaced U-boat forced the submarine to dive immediately, where it was slower and consumed its batteries rapidly. An aircraft equipped with depth charges or bombs could sink or seriously damage a surfaced U-boat before the submarine could complete an emergency crash dive. The air gap was the stretch of water where U-boats could operate on the surface in relative safety, charging their batteries, communicating with Dönitz's headquarters in France, and coordinating Wolfpack attacks. Removing that operational safety would remove a fundamental tactical advantage from every U-boat that operated in those waters. If this story matters to you, subscribe to the channel. Just subscribe. That is all. Thank you. The Very Long-Range Modification Program for the B-24 Liberator bomber had been under discussion and development in both the British and American commands for more than a year before May of 1943. The standard B-24 in its base configuration had insufficient operational range to cover the air gap. A series of modifications, including the installation of additional internal fuel tanks and the removal of most of the bomber's defensive armament to reduce total weight, produced a variant designated the Very Long-Range Liberator that could reach the air gap from airfields in Iceland, Northern Ireland, and Newfoundland. The modified Very Long-Range aircraft had existed in small numbers before May of 1943. The allocation of sufficient numbers of these VLR aircraft to the anti-submarine patrol mission had not happened at operational scale until early 1943, driven in part by the crisis made evident in the March shipping loss figures. The second technological factor was the development and deployment of centimetric radar. Standard aircraft search radar of the period operated at wavelengths of approximately 1.5 meters. German submarines had been equipped with the METOX radar warning receiver, which detected emissions at that wavelength and gave a U-boat crew time to dive before an aircraft could approach to effective attack range. The cavity magnetron, a British invention developed in 1940, produced radar emissions at approximately 10 centimeters wavelength. The METOX detector was entirely unable to detect 10 centimeter radar emissions. When aircraft equipped with the new ASV Mark III centimetric radar began operating over the North Atlantic in numbers, they could detect surfaced U-boats at night without the submarine crews receiving any warning at all. The first indication a U-boat crew received of the new radar's existence was when depth charges arrived in the water around them. German U-boat command initially assumed that Allied aircraft were homing in on emissions from the METOX devices themselves. This was a technically plausible hypothesis that led to METOX devices being removed and replaced with alternatives that provided no improvement against centimetric radar. High-frequency direction finding, designated HFDF and called HFDUF by Allied radio operators, was the third technological factor. Dönitz's Wolfpack coordination system required the U-boats at sea to transmit regular radio messages to his headquarters on the French Atlantic coast. The positions, convoy contacts, and tactical reports that made Wolfpack coordination operationally possible also emitted radio signals that shore-based and ship-based HFDF stations could use to locate the transmitting submarine. A U-boat transmitting a convoy sighting report that Dönitz needed to orchestrate a Wolfpack attack was simultaneously providing its approximate position to Allied direction-finding operators. Ships in the convoy escort equipped with shipboard HFDF could provide the convoy commander with the bearing of U-boat transmissions and, with triangulation from other stations, approximate positions. This capability allowed convoy escorts to take offensive action against U-boats that had not yet attacked, rather than being limited to responding to submarines that had already fired their torpedoes. The fourth critical factor was the organizational reform of the escort support groups. Admiral Max Horton had taken command of Western Approaches Command in November of 1942, replacing Admiral Percy Noble. His reorganization produced, among other structural changes, dedicated support groups, escort forces that were not permanently assigned to specific convoys, but could be directed at operational need to reinforce convoy battles already in progress. The previous system had permanently assigned specific escort vessels to specific convoys, which meant that when a Wolfpack overwhelmed a convoy's defenders, those defenders were essentially all that was available. The support group system meant that a convoy under heavy U-boat attack could receive reinforcement from fresh escort ships with full depth charge loads and rested crews. Captain Johnny Walker's second support group, operating under his direct command from the sloop HMS Starling, was the most effective of these support groups. The convergence of these four factors at operational scale in the Atlantic did not happen instantly or suddenly. The VLR Liberators had been available in small operational numbers since late 1942. The centimetric radar had been fitted to anti-submarine aircraft since early 1943. The HFDF direction finding equipment had been in use in various forms since 1941. The support group organizational structure dated from Horton's reforms in the winter period of 1942 to 1943. What happened in April and May of 1943 was that all four elements reached sufficient operational density at the same time, simultaneously, in the waters where the U-boat campaign was being conducted. The air gap was now being patrolled by VLR aircraft. The surfaced U-boats were being surprised at night by aircraft they could not detect. Their radio transmissions were being located by HFDF. Their Wolfpack attacks against convoys were being met by support groups that arrived with resources the attacking U-boats had not anticipated. Convoy ONS-5 was attacked by German U-boat Wolfpacks between the 29th of April and 6th of May 1943. The attacking force was composed of multiple coordinated Wolfpack groups totaling more than 30 submarines. The convoy escorts sank 6 U-boats and damaged 7 others. 12 Allied merchant ships were lost. This was not a clear Allied victory in terms of merchant ships lost. It was, however, the first major convoy battle of the war, in which the exchange rate had moved decisively against the attacking U-boats. Germany had lost 6 operational submarines to sink 12 merchant ships. In earlier convoy battles of the war, U-boats had regularly achieved much higher ratios of merchant ships sunk per submarine lost. The Admiralty calculated that at the loss exchange rate demonstrated in ONS-5, the U-boat campaign could not continue to deplete Allied shipping faster than Allied production could replace it. Convoy SC-130 ran from May 15th to May 25th of 1943. The convoy's escorts, reinforced by arriving support groups, sank 5 attacking U-boats. No Allied merchant ships were sunk or lost. Among the 5 U-boats sunk during the SC-130 battle was U-954, which went to the bottom on May 19th with all hands. The U-954's crew included Oberleutnant zur See Peter Dönitz, the Admiral's 21-year-old son and only child. Dönitz received the notification of his son's death while simultaneously processing the accumulating loss reports from May's convoy battles. He wrote about the campaign losses in his war diary. He did not write about Peter separately or at length. He continued to command the U-boat campaign. By May 24, 1943, the numbers were definitive. 43 German submarines had been sunk in 31 days. 1,832 men had died inside those 43 submarines. 183 from those crews had survived. The U-boat fleet that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic in March of 1943 had lost a quarter of its operational strength in a single month at the moment of its largest size. Dönitz issued the withdrawal order on May 24th. He publicly and officially framed it as temporary. He described it in his private war diary as a recognition that operating submarines in the North Atlantic under the current tactical conditions produced losses at a rate the campaign could not possibly sustain. He later used the phrase Stalingrad of the U-boat arm to describe what May of 1943 had been. The specific experience of a U-boat crew in May of 1943 was qualitatively different from what the same crew would have encountered 6 months earlier. A crew returning from a patrol in late 1942 would have crossed the Bay of Biscay with reasonable confidence that air patrols they might encounter would be detectable by their METOX receivers. They would have operated in the air gap with the understanding that no land-based aircraft could reach them there. They would have surfaced at night to charge batteries and transmit position reports with the reasonable expectation that darkness provided meaningful concealment from patrolling aircraft. In May of 1943, none of those prior assumptions remained operationally valid. The METOX receivers detected nothing when an aircraft equipped with centimetric radar was approaching at night. The air gap was now being crossed by VLR Liberators. Aircraft were attacking surfaced U-boats at night, using centimetric radar that the submarines could neither detect nor effectively evade before the aircraft was overhead. Dönitz had suspected for some time before May of 1943 that Allied anti-submarine technology was changing in ways that German intelligence had not fully characterized. The sudden increase in U-boat losses from air attack in early 1943, and particularly the pattern of submarines being attacked at night without any warning, had raised serious concerns in the U-boat command. The hypothesis was investigated and found to be technically plausible. The METOX devices were removed from operational U-boats and replaced with the Naxos receiver, which operated at different radio frequencies. The U-boat losses from night air attacks continued at the same unsatisfactory rate. The correct explanation, that Allied aircraft were using a new centimetric radar wavelength that no existing German detector could find, was not accepted by German intelligence until late 1943, long after the operational damage had been done. The intelligence failure was not simply a matter of missing raw operational information. It was a failure to correctly identify which available hypothesis best explained the specific observed pattern of U-boat losses. The milk cow submarine tankers that Dönitz depended on to extend operational U-boat patrol ranges became specific Allied targets as the full significance of the resupply system became understood. Allied naval and air forces tracked and attacked the Type 14-4 supply submarines with increasing operational success through 1943. The loss of individual milk cow tankers forced operational U-boats in the South Atlantic and Mid-Atlantic to return to port without completing their planned patrol periods. The resupply network that had allowed Dönitz to maintain substantially more submarines on station simultaneously than French port distances would otherwise permit began to contract. This contraction was not yet fully reflected in May of 1943, but it was part of the systematic dismantling of the U-boat campaign's logistical infrastructure that continued through the remainder of the year. The German submarine crews who sailed on patrol in May of 1943 were not entirely uninformed about the changes in their operational environment. The pre-patrol briefings from U-boat command had acknowledged increasing losses and had attributed them to various identified causes. What the crews departing on their patrols in early May could not know was the specific nature of the technological combination that was operating against them. They could know, from the briefings and from the visible absence of returning crews, that losses were increasing. They could not know that the aircraft hunting them at night used radar they could not detect, or that the convoys they were approaching had already received approximate position reports from HFDF, or that support groups with full depth charges could reinforce any convoy battle. The tactical environment in the Atlantic had been transformed in ways that the operational intelligence available to U-boat crews in May of 1943 did not fully reflect. The convoy battles of May of 1943 produced results that, taken together, reversed the loss exchange rate of the previous 6 months. In the period from July of 1942 through March of 1943, U-boats had consistently sunk more merchant tonnage per submarine lost than the Allied supply chain could sustain. In May of 1943, that exchange rate ratio finally reversed. The 43 U-boats lost in May represented an irreplaceable collective loss of accumulated crew experience, specialized training, and operational knowledge. German U-boat crew members required many months of highly specialized training. The commissioned officers required years of development. The men who died inside the 43 submarines of May 1943 were not simply material that could be replaced at the rate of German submarine production. They were the experienced and trained crews that the U-boat campaign had spent the previous 3 years developing, and in May of 1943 they were gone. Walker's second support group demonstrated precisely what the escort support group concept could accomplish when given the right equipment and doctrine. During the convoy battles of spring 1943, Walker developed and refined what he called the creeping attack, a method of maintaining constant ASDIC contact with a submerged U-boat while positioning other ships for depth charge attacks that the targeted submarine could not evade. The technique required patience and close coordination between multiple escort vessels, skills that the support group structure and extended training programs of Western Approach's command had been systematically building since Horton's reforms. The U-boat that Walker held submerged for hours faced progressively increasing battery depletion and mounting crew exhaustion. When the U-boat eventually had to surface or die from battery and air failure, it surfaced into the waiting escorts. Walker sank 20 U-boats during the war and was appointed Companion of the Bath by the Admiralty for his service. He died of a cerebral thrombosis in July of 1944 at the age of 48, still in command of his group. The withdrawal order of May 24, 1943, was publicly presented by Dönitz as temporary, a tactical pause while Germany developed countermeasures for the new Allied anti-submarine capabilities. In his private communications and war diary, he was considerably less optimistic. He wrote that the U-boats had suffered losses that the campaign could not sustain, and that the tactical environment had changed in ways that required a fundamental technical response before operations could resume effectively. The response he planned was primarily technical. New torpedoes that could home on propeller noise, new radar warning receivers that could detect centimetric emissions, a retractable schnorkel device that would allow diesel submarines to charge their batteries while remaining submerged, and improved anti-aircraft armament for submarines caught on the surface. Some of these systems were already under development. Others required months of additional engineering work. None of them was operationally available in May of 1943. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is what happened when Dönitz brought the U-boats back in the autumn of 1943 with new equipment, why the return failed even with the new technology, what the survival odds looked like for the men who served in U-boats through the war, and why the Atlantic's outcome in May of 1943 made the Normandy landings 14 months later possible. Do not go anywhere. The U-boats did eventually return to the North Atlantic. In September and October of 1943, Dönitz sent them back with the new Zaunkönig acoustic torpedo, which homed on ship propeller noise and was specifically intended to kill escort vessels rather than merchant ships. The first convoy the returning U-boats attacked was the combined convoy ONS-18 and ON-202, combined for mutual escort support. The Zaunkönig torpedoes sank 3 Allied escort vessels on September 20, 1943. This result was exactly what the acoustic torpedo had been designed to accomplish. It was also the only convoy battle in which the Zaunkönig produced results of this scale. Allied commanders, informed that Germany had developed an acoustic homing torpedo, quickly fitted escort vessels with the Foxer noisemaker, a device towed behind an escort that produced noise louder than the ship's own propeller and drew the acoustic torpedo to the decoy rather than the escort. The Foxer decoy device was deployed within weeks. The Zaunkönig tactical advantage lasted less than a month in operational use. This pattern of action and rapid Allied counteraction repeated throughout the autumn and winter of 1943. Germany introduced a tactical countermeasure. The Allies responded with a countermeasure within weeks or a few months. The schnorkel, which allowed U-boats to run their diesel engines while remaining submerged, reduced the window during which aircraft could detect a surfaced submarine. It did not eliminate the detection window and did not address the HFDF problem, a U-boat transmitting its mandatory position reports while snorkeling was still locatable by direction finding. The METOX replacement receivers eventually provided some warning of centimetric radar emissions, but aircraft tactics adapted around them. The improved anti-aircraft armament that Dönitz fitted to some U-boats and sent into the Bay of Biscay to fight back against patrolling aircraft produced a brief period of increased danger for British Coastal Command, but the losses the anti-aircraft boats themselves sustained were heavier than the damage they inflicted. By the end of 1943, it was operationally clear that the return of the U-boats had not reversed the decisive result of Black May. The tactical environment that had produced 43 U-boat sinkings in May was still producing comparable results. The human cost of the U-boat campaign over its entire duration is the number that puts Black May in its broadest context. Germany commissioned approximately 1,162 U-boats during the war. Of these, approximately 785 were sunk. Approximately 28,000 U-boat personnel died in the war, from a total wartime service of approximately 40,000 men. The overall casualty rate for U-boat crew members was approximately 69% killed or missing. For crews serving in the last 2 years of the war, After the technological reversal of May 1943, the casualty rate was significantly higher. A U-boat crew departing on patrol in the spring of 1944 had a statistical probability of death that had gone from the dangerous but survivable odds of the early war years to something closer to a certain death sentence. The men who crewed German U-boats in the final years of the war were not ignorant of this. They sailed anyway. Their reasons, including duty, coercion, institutional culture, and individual variation in the capacity for denial, are not reducible to a simple explanation. The Allied merchant sailors who died in the Battle of the Atlantic died in the other part of the casualty accounting. Approximately 30,000 merchant sailors from the Allied nations were killed in the Atlantic campaign between 1939 and 1945. The ships they sailed in carried food, fuel, weapons, vehicles, and raw materials, without which Britain could not have remained in the war, and without which the American military build-up in Britain for the eventual invasion of Europe could not have been sustained. The German U-boats sank approximately 3,000 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic during the war. The merchant sailors who died in those ships were not military personnel in the conventional sense. They were civilian employees of shipping companies, required by the economics of wartime, to take their ships across waters where German submarines were hunting them. Their casualty rate was comparable to that of British Army infantry in some engagements of the First World War. It is not a number that appears frequently in the summaries of the Battle of the Atlantic. September 1939. Battle of the Atlantic begins with Germany's declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare. 1942. The happy time for U-boats. Record tonnage sunk. American coastal convoys not yet properly organized. March 1943. Peak German success. More than 600,000 tons of Allied shipping sunk. British Admiralty internally assesses campaign as potentially war-ending. April 1943. U-boat operational tempo decreases as submarines return to port for resupply. 29th April to 6th May. Convoy ONS-5. 12 Allied ships lost, 6 U-boats sunk. First major reversal of the exchange rate. 15th to 25th May. Convoy SC-130. 0 Allied ships lost, 5 U-boats sunk. Peter Dönitz dies aboard U-954. 24th May. Dönitz orders withdrawal from North Atlantic. 43 U-boats lost in May. September to October 1943. U-boats return with Zaunkönig acoustic torpedo. Fokker countermeasure deployed within weeks. 1944 to 1945. U-boats continue patrols. Casualty rate reaches approximately 69% for the war as a whole. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Allied landings in Normandy possible because Atlantic supply line remained open. 4 factors produced Black May: the technological convergence at operational scale, the German intelligence failure on centimetric radar, Horten's organizational reforms, and the structural vulnerability of Dönitz's coordination system to HFDF. The first factor was the technological convergence. Each of the 4 technologies had existed before May of 1943. The VLR Liberators, the centimetric radar, the HFDF, and the support group organization had each been present in the Atlantic in some form since late 1942 or earlier. What happened in April and May was that all 4 technologies reached sufficient density simultaneously in the operational area where Germany's largest U-boat force was conducting its most intensive campaign. The air gap was covered while the centimetric radar was operational, while the HFDF network was active, while support groups were available to reinforce any convoy battle that developed. Germany's U-boats were not facing one new problem. They were facing 4 simultaneously. The second factor was the German intelligence failure on centimetric radar. The pattern of increasing night air attack losses was detectable in the U-boat loss records from early 1943. The incorrect hypothesis that METOX was emitting detectable signals was investigated and implemented as a response before the correct hypothesis was seriously considered. The time lost to this incorrect response was measured in U-boats. If German intelligence had correctly identified centimetric radar as the mechanism of the night attack losses in February or March of 1943, rather than late in the year, The specific technological advantage of the ASV Mark III radar would have been shorter. The Naxos receiver that could detect centimetric emissions would have been developed and deployed sooner. The window during which centimetric radar provided undetectable surprise would have been narrower. Germany did not have this intelligence. The incorrect hypothesis cost it months. The third factor was Horton's organizational reform. The Western approach's reorganization that Horton implemented after taking command in November of 1942 was not primarily technological. It was doctrinal and organizational. Better training for escort crews, improved coordination between ships in an escort group, the development of the support group concept, and the identification and promotion of officers like Walker, who had demonstrated exceptional anti-submarine capability. These reforms took time to produce operational results. The time they required is why March of 1943 was still a German success, and May was not. The reforms that Horton put in place in the winter of 1942 to 43 produced their full operational effect in the spring of 1943, coinciding with the deployment of the technological systems that completed the reversal. The fourth factor was the structural vulnerability of the Wolfpack system to HFDF. Dönitz's coordination system was the most effective method available in 1943 for concentrating multiple submarines against a single convoy. It required continuous radio communication between the U-boats at sea and his headquarters in France. This communication was unavoidable. Without it, the Wolfpack could not form, could not be directed to a convoy's position, and could not coordinate its attacks. The HFDF system that located U-boats when they transmitted did not eliminate the Wolfpack. It did eliminate the Wolfpack's ability to approach a convoy without the convoy's escorts having a rough idea of where it was coming from. A convoy that knew the approximate direction of a U-boat contact could maneuver to avoid it, or could send an escort in the direction of the contact to attack before the U-boat found the convoy. This was not a perfect system. It was enough. The paradox at the center of Black May is not subtle, but it is worth stating precisely. Germany's U-boat campaign was closest to success in March of 1943, when it sank nearly 700,000 tons of Allied shipping. It was defeated in May of 1943, 2 months later, not by a reduction in German submarine numbers, but by a specific technological and organizational environment that had been built around the convoys while Germany's largest U-boat force was being assembled and deployed. Dönitz had 240 operational submarines in May. He had more submarines, more milk cow resupply capacity, and a more developed Wolfpack coordination system than at any previous point in the war. What he did not have was a working centimetric radar detector, any defense against VLR aircraft in the air gap, any way to prevent HFDF from locating his transmitting submarines, or any way to prevent support groups from reinforcing convoy battles. He could not fix any of these in May of 1943. He fixed some of them later. He never fixed all of them simultaneously. The window during which all 4 Allied advantages operated simultaneously, with no German countermeasure for any of them, was the window in which 43 U-boats died. Karl Dönitz was appointed Grand Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine in January of 1943, 4 months before Black May. He was appointed by Hitler as his successor, as Führer in the political testament Hitler signed on April 29, 1945, 1 day before Hitler's death in Berlin. Dönitz served as Führer of Germany for precisely 23 days. He was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against international peace. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was released from Spandau prison in October of 1956. He died in December of 1981, at the age of 89. Johnny Walker died in Liverpool on July 9, 1944, from a cerebral thrombosis attributed to exhaustion, 48 years old. The 1,632 men who died in the 43 U-boats of May 1943 have no comparable accounting of their subsequent careers. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you the stories. The naval history is reduced to a casualty number and a month name, without telling you that Germany's U-boat campaign was closest to severing Britain's supply lines in March of 1943, and was broken 2 months later, not by increasing Allied numbers, but by the specific convergence of 4 technologies operating simultaneously without a German countermeasure for any of them. That Dönitz's son Peter died in a U-boat sunk during the last successful convoy battle of the month. That the merchant sailors who died in the Atlantic represented a casualty rate comparable to infantry in some of the worst engagements of the First World War, or that the survival of the Atlantic supply line is why the Allied landings in Normandy 14 months later were possible. Hit subscribe then like so. This reaches the people who should understand what 43 U-boats in 31 days means about the relationship between technological convergence and strategic turning points. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one. The strategic consequence of the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic is most clearly visible in what it made possible. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, required the largest amphibious assault force in history to be assembled, supplied, and transported across the English Channel. That force required months of accumulated supplies, vehicles, weapons, ammunition, fuel, food, and reinforcements that had to be shipped from North America to Britain before the operation could begin. If the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost, if the U-boat campaign had succeeded in severing Britain's supply lines in the spring of 1943, none of those supplies would have arrived. There would have been no landing force to assemble. The Allied strategy of opening a second front in Western Europe depended on the Atlantic supply line remaining open. The Atlantic supply line remained open because the U-boat campaign was broken in May of 1943. The production figures that underlie the tonnage war are worth stating plainly. American shipyards in 1943 produced approximately 19 million tons of new shipping. German U-boats in the same year sank approximately 3 million tons. The ratio of Allied production to Allied losses had shifted decisively by the end of 1943. Even if the U-boat campaign had maintained its May losses, the replacement rate from American shipyards would have exceeded the loss rate. The tonnage war that Dönitz had nearly won in the spring of 1943 was being decided not only by the anti-submarine campaign, but by the American industrial capacity that had been mobilizing since December of 1941. By late 1943, the mathematics that had briefly been in Germany's favor had shifted permanently in the Allies' favor. The specific experience of convoy SC-130, which produced 0 Allied ship losses while sinking 5 U-boats, represents the clearest single demonstration of what the May tactical environment had become. SC-130 was not a one-sided engagement from the beginning. Multiple German U-boat Wolfpacks attempted to attack it over a period of approximately 10 days. They were detected by HFDF when they transmitted. They were attacked by escort aircraft using centimetric radar. When they pressed their attacks, they encountered escort and support group vessels that had been trained and organized under Horten's system. 5 U-boats were sunk, attempting to attack a convoy that lost not one merchant ship. The convoy's escorts and support groups had produced a result that would have been considered impossible by the standards of any previous phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. The convoy's escorts had sunk more submarines than the convoy itself had lost ships. Dönitz's decision to continue the U-boat campaign after May of 1943, despite his acknowledgement that the tactical environment had become unsustainable, requires some explanation. The conventional military analysis of the decision would be that he had no choice. Germany needed to maintain pressure on Allied shipping, and the U-boats were the only instrument available for that purpose. But Dönitz also had institutional reasons to continue. He had built the U-boat force over a decade. It was the instrument of German naval power, in which he had invested most of his career. The idea that it had been fundamentally defeated was not one he appears to have fully accepted even in May of 1943. His framing of the withdrawal as temporary was not simply propaganda for the German public. It reflected his genuine belief that technological countermeasures would restore the U-boat's effectiveness. He was wrong about the speed at which that restoration could occur, and wrong about the degree to which it could ever be complete. The crews who sailed in U-boats after Black May knew what the odds had become. The informal communication networks within the U-boat service, the visible departure of boats that did not return, and the faces missing from briefings and mess halls all conveyed what the official loss statistics confirmed when examined after the war. A U-boat crew member who entered operational service in the second half of 1943 had a significantly lower probability of surviving the war than any of his predecessors in any previous year. The men who continued to sail understood this in roughly the way that soldiers understand casualty rates, without ever being given the official numbers. They continued to sail. Their individual reasons, the combination of duty, institutional loyalty, absence of alternatives, and the human capacity to exempt oneself from statistical probability, represent a record of the human experience of war that the strategic analysis of Black May cannot fully contain.